Are We Heading for the Apocalypse? I'm sure you thought, yeah, I better get involved in that one. It sounds like it might be important. Rutger Bregman, who is from the Netherlands. He's a thinker, writer, historian, contemplator of human society. And next to Rutger is Neil Ferguson, a man whose books on empire, on civilization, have stirred up a great deal of debate and controversy all around the world. So I'm going to just turn to you both and just play with this word apocalypse. You know, we've lived through COVID. We've all managed to make it here with nasal swabs up our noses and masks on and coping with a very new world. Have the two of you, as a result mostly of COVID, but also of a geopolitical situation which is self-evidently full of tension and fear, have both of you in recent times begun to feel that you might be living in the end of times?
Right, we've had this massive transformation in the last 200 years, mainly built on, fossil fuels and the extraordinary energy that lies in there. And we're taking a huge gamble, and there are some existential risks out there that could, kill us all. I think the chance is certainly there. We just don't know yet. I think the challenge is to identify those risks, to see them in the right proportions and act accordingly.
It's not the end of the world we really have to worry about. It's just lots and lots of disasters that we don't manage very well. What's interesting to me is that we focus a lot these days on the climate risk, and that dominates international conferences like this. But that's a relatively slow-moving threat to the species compared with a pandemic, as we saw last year. I'm vividly reminded of sitting at Davos in January of 2020. The agenda was dominated by climate change, and a pandemic had already begun. And you'll remember this, Victor. We noticed that there were 4 people from Wuhan on the participants list at the World Economic Forum. With amazing speed, that virus spread around the world. If it had been a significantly more deadly virus, you can see what could easily happen. But what's interesting about humanity is we've added new forms of mass destruction to the ones that always existed, like plagues, wars have always existed. But now, think of the pandemonium that would ensue in the event of full-blown cyber warfare. Now, I don't think that would be an extinction-level event, but it would cause enormous disruption and destruction if we had full-scale outages and everything stopped working.
If we assume that there are potential risks out there that could threaten the survival of our species, the question then becomes, is there anything in our history to suggest that we are capable of acting in collaborative, cooperative ways to address those threats? And what would your response to that be?
What makes human beings special? What distinguishes us from other animals in the animal kingdom, or what distinguishes us among primates? I would say that our essential superpower is our ability to work together, or you could even say our friendliness.
It's how we can maximize our resilience and maximize the positives that are so evident in our societies and try to minimize the negatives.
So I'd like to make a distinction first between optimism and hope. So I never really like the word optimism because it suggests a form of complacency to me, right? Where you just say, things will turn out to be all right, don't worry. We're richer, we're wealthier, we're healthier than ever. Look at all the wonderful graphs that people like Steven Pinker show us. I think it makes you a little bit lazy. Hope is different. Hope is about the possibility of change. It's about the recognition that things can be different, that there are lots of different scenarios. I think that certainly means that we have to focus on big threats like climate change. I would also agree with Neil, that we focus way too less on the risks of synthetic biology, and maybe also, I'm not sure if you agree with that, the risk of artificial intelligence. I would say, though, that it seems to make sense as well, because I wonder what I should tell, for example, my mother about the risk of synthetic biology, right? I don't think there's anything she can do with it, about it, maybe she could donate to some fund of, I don't know, bio-risk security analysts, something like that. I don't really know if she could make a difference. But with climate change, it's quite obvious, right? We all have to change our lives, and we need to make a massive transformation of our whole economy and society. So in that way, I think it makes sense that there's much more attention, at least in the public domain, to climate change, even though the risk of synthetic biology may be just as great or even greater.
I think it's probably greater because it's potentially faster acting. But just to illustrate my less hopeful perspective, we've been talking about climate change for as long as I can remember. Certainly conferences on that subject have been happening since the 1990s. And we have thus far failed to stop carbon dioxide emissions from increasing year on year. Since the Paris Climate Accord, they have increased, but 48% of the increase is due to China. And as we were discussing earlier, Greta Thunberg is good at lecturing Western businesses at Davos, but I've yet to hear her lecture Xi Jinping, and I don't yet know how, and nobody has told me, certainly not John Kerry, how you constrain China from building coal-burning power stations every month, which they have been doing, and indeed show no signs of stopping doing. Of course, they say that they're going to reform themselves, but it's the old St. Augustine line, make me virtuous, but not yet. And so the big problem with the climate debate is that it's not consequent. In the end, it doesn't hugely matter what Europeans and North Americans do if China continues down this path. The planet will continue to warm with all the unforeseeable consequences. So I worry a little bit that talking about these issues, as we've done for decades, ultimately produces no meaningful result because nobody's prepared to say, until you constrain China, and it must be said also India, you cannot achieve anything meaningful. That's the reality. And we kid ourselves. We engage in a quasi-religious activity, which is Al Gore preaches to us, and Greta Thunberg harangues us like some medieval child saint, and then we get in the private planes and fly home feeling somehow cleansed. And the Chinese continue to burn the coal. If every Chinese family owned a Tesla, Elon Musk would be happy. But if they charge the Teslas on coal-generated electricity, the planet burns. Why is that so seldom pointed out at these events? I'll tell you why. Because the Chinese buy a great deal of green technology, which ensures that the Extinction Rebellion activists say very little indeed about the fact that China is driving climate change right now.
So that it might be, not very effective to lecture China if you can't even change your own behavior, right? So, if I want to change someone else's behavior, I try to make sure I update my own behavior.
But the West has reduced emissions. And I don't see the power of example being very effective in Beijing.
Well, the Chinese have now made some pretty extraordinary commitments to decarbonization by 2050. I mean, Xi Jinping has gone further than many thought he ever would in terms of long-term promises to get carbon out of the Chinese economy. And at the same time, the United States hasn't gone as far as many in the US and Europe hoped it would.
The United States contributed precisely 0% to the increase in carbon dioxide emissions since the Paris Accord.
Because it was already at an extraordinary level.
Because then you get to the question of historic inequalities. We in the West are at a certain level of industrialized development because for 200 years we've been pouring carbon into the atmosphere. The Indians and the Chinese are getting very good at pouring carbon into the atmosphere, but they haven't been doing it for half as long.
So let me just understand the line of reasoning here. So because of history, we should allow the Chinese and the Indians to continue to emit fossil fuels, contributing to the problem of climate change, and we should, in fact, impose all the reductions that need to be imposed on ourselves. Is this some kind of climate reparations strategy?
Not all at all, but of course,
sure, the Chinese would be very grateful if we would do this.
Your argument works if the Chinese are doing nothing at all, which isn't true. And your argument also only works if you're not to accept that those who, have put most carbon into the atmosphere need to show leadership in taking the world in a new direction.
This is the most naive argument that people in the West make, and they can't seem to see how preposterous it is. It is essentially saying, let me translate this into plain English, let us increase the costs of energy to consumers and businesses in the Western world by a really significant amount, so that we drive down through the price mechanism the emissions of carbon dioxide, and leave the Chinese completely a free hand to burn as much coal as they like. If this isn't a way to fast-track China's takeover of the world, I don't know what else would do it. It's just preposterous nonsense. And I'm sick of hearing this argument at events like this. It is time we had a major reality check on this whole climate issue.
Well, I would agree that we need a reality check. I wonder, though, what your alternative is. I mean, we just had the recent IPCC report, right? And we know that we're now on track for a world that is 3 degrees warmer in 2100. And the world is not going to stop warming after that. It could also be warmer, by the way. I mean, we also run the risk of excessive climate change. Could be 4 degrees, could be 5 degrees. We could also be lucky, could also only be 2 degrees. But we're taking a huge gamble, a huge risk. Now, we can sort of argue about global responsibilities, and I agree with you. I mean, there's way too little attention to the role that China and India play. It just seems, what is the alternative? Do you want to do nothing at all and just say, we're not reducing our energy consumption as long as the Chinese aren't doing it?
I believe Europe showing the way means also you show that it's possible to live differently. Somebody has to do it. If you don't start, nobody will follow. And that nobody's following now doesn't mean anything for me.
Can I add something about the European role here? Because it's very easy and popular to be cynical about, the role that especially the European Union has played in the last couple of years and decades. Now, I think Americans in general are very good at giving speeches, right? We Europeans are so bad at it that we even steal their language, right? Their rhetorical flourishes, right? We talk about the Green Deal, or we talk about a war-style mobilization, just as the Americans did during the Second World War. But then if you look at the American Green New Deal, what is it? Well, it's just a wish list of left-wing progressives in the US that's not really going to happen. If you look at the Green Deal in the EU, well, it's actually a really ambitious, significant piece of policy that's now being proposed. If you look at the historic role that European countries have played in facing the threat of climate change, think of wind energy. Central role has been played by Denmark. Think of solar energy. Well, solar energy's cost wouldn't have dropped by more than 90% in the last 10 years if Germany wouldn't have invested massively in it. Now, you would probably say, well, the Germans have been very stupid by switching off their nuclear power plants. I completely agree. But again, there are real examples here of Western, or in this case, European leadership. And I think that especially the role when it is very important when it comes to technology, and R&D. And Europe has shown that it can play an enormously important role. Same is true, by the way, of the emission trading system, right? It's, again, very unpopular, but if you look at the size of it and the effect that it has right now in Europe, it's pretty significant in how it's driving down emissions. It's just that, European politicians are so bad at giving speeches about it. We don't say things like, yes, we can, or whatever, but if you look at what's actually happening and what we're doing, it's much more impressive.
If the COVID-19 pandemic response were an exam, many world leaders would have to cheat on their finals to obtain a passing grade. I'm wondering if you agree with that the pandemic was actually worse than it could have been because of poor leadership, but also something that really worries me that brings us a step closer to an apocalypse. One of the first things the WHO said is don't impose trade and travel restrictions. Right out of the gate, most politicians ignored that advice and went ahead anyway. So if we have another pandemic, God forbid, even worse than this one, and there's no coordinating moral authority body like the WHO to tell people what to do, are we a step closer? Thanks.
I think there really aren't many Western democracies that can say we deserve an A for our handling of COVID. But if anybody deserves an F, it's surely China, where the pandemic originated. This was a super Chernobyl in the sense that the Chinese Communist Party behaved exactly like its Soviet counterparts in attempting to cover up the disaster, except that this cover-up had the consequence of 4.5 million, and most likely a much larger number, The Economist thinks 15 million, people dying prematurely around the world. Now, I think the big problem that one can identify when one looks around the world is that most Western countries, and actually most countries broadly, didn't so much suffer from inept leadership. I think the problem was further down the chain of command because public health bureaucracies didn't see what they saw in Taiwan and South Korea, which was that a new version of SARS that was less lethal but more contagious would be extremely hard to deal with. And the only way you could deal with it was very rapidly restricting access of infected people to the wider society. So the country that got it most right last year was Taiwan, and South Korea came in second. And what they got right was you ramp up testing, you use contact tracing, and you isolate potentially infected people. And almost no Western country did that. Ironically, those that did well last year did much worse this year, because those that did badly last year were the ones that did well with vaccines, and those that did well last year didn't really bother with vaccines.
What kind of features are in the society that allow to carry on this nation project regardless of Russian aggression and pandemics? What are those features that help us persevere, and how can we embed them in our modern governance to be able to carry on? Thank you.
I think one of the lessons of last year was that countries that are used to living in a hostile neighborhood were much quicker to react and, generally speaking, perform better than more complacent countries. I mentioned Taiwan and South Korea. Israel has also been extremely impressive in dealing with this shape-shifting virus. And I think Ukraine needs to look at those countries and say to itself, it is an advantage to be paranoid about a hostile neighbor. Because if you're paranoid about a hostile neighbor, you know that it can come in many different forms. It can be cyber attack, it can be information warfare, it can be conventional warfare, it could even be biological warfare. So I think Ukraine needs to look at Taiwan in particular, but also at South Korea, and say, what is it that being threatened has done? And the answer is it has really encouraged those countries to modernize not just their defenses, but their system of government. There are few countries that use technology more effectively to make government accountable to the citizens than Taiwan.
Despite the fact that on the whole human beings are becoming more prosperous, they are also becoming more unequal, and that the gap between the richest and the poorest in societies, particularly capitalist societies, is becoming ever wider. I'm not now talking about an extinction event, but in terms of a sustainability question, is that form of society, and broadly it's exacerbated by modern day capitalism, is that sustainable, or do you think inequality could be sowing the seeds of internal collapse of those societies?
I would say that one of the depressing things about highly unequal societies is that they can also be quite stable, actually. If you look at the idea of meritocracy, for example, that people basically, if you work hard, you get what you deserve, etc. Actually, in more unequal societies, the poor have a stronger conviction that the rich really deserve, all their power and money. And if you look at more equal societies, where I'm from, the Netherlands, for example, well, we don't really buy into that. So that is maybe a little bit depressing. So now, what's also interesting to point out is that there's a great book called The Great Leveler by Walter Scheidel, if I remember correctly.
Yes.
The book makes the argument that actually the great equalizers are pandemics and wars, etc. If you look at some of the graphs about inequality in Europe, it's really striking that, for example, the countries that participated in the First World War had a much stronger reduction in inequality than those countries that didn't, such as the Netherlands, for example. And then after the Second World War, you see this major reduction in inequality. It's just that we've been without a period of major crises for so long that maybe that has caused inequality to go up and up and up and up and up again. Now the question is whether the COVID pandemic will make a difference. One thing that people were all talking about at the beginning of the pandemic were these so-called vital jobs, right? The essential workers. Suddenly it became very clear that some people do really important work and others, well, maybe not so much. You know, that we were very much reliant on the care workers and the teachers and the nurses and you name it. And if they go on strike, well, that's a huge problem. And if we go on strike, well, maybe it's not all that much of a problem. I often like to talk about, you know, this one banker strike that we know of in all of world history that happened in Ireland in the 1970s. The bankers went on strike and the strike lasted for 6 months and it didn't change anything. You know, they came back and said, all right, we'll get back to work. So maybe a moment of crisis helps you to realize once again what's really important, who are the real wealth creators, etc.
Okay, quick thought on that, Neil, then we've got to wrap.
Inequality is the price or consequence of a free and peaceful and innovative society. Deal with it. If you don't like the inequality that your society produces, left to market forces and meritocracy, have more progressive taxation. It's not that difficult. And each society makes a decision through the political process what level of progressivism to have in its income tax system. The Dutch like a lot, Americans not so much. This is how democracy works. It's not complicated.
A lovely, concise way of wrapping up a big discussion. Ladies and gentlemen, we promised you a discussion about the apocalypse, and we've given you something that has, I hope, generated a lot of very big thought.